Righto. So I'm going to give a talk about this special little bird, the plains wanderer, with a focus on some of the work I've been involved with on the northern plains of Victoria, but also some of the research underway on the Victorian volcanic plains, which might be of interest to many of you. Before I get going, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from Jarrah country in central Victoria and pay respect to elders past and present and acknowledge the deep and enduring connections of First Nations people right across Australia to country. So, unfortunately, the story of people ringing alarm bells about the decline of the plains wanderer isn't a new one. Back in 1926, bird conservationists had noticed that this unusual quail-like bird was being observed much less around Melbourne's western fringes and Victoria more broadly. And they knew that the growing Melbourne population was having a negative impact on the land and was a problem for the bird. And the sad thing is, here we are 100 years later, having not really addressed threats to our grasslands and its dependent species. And we find that the plains wanderer is very close to the edge of extinction. So yeah, just wanted to put this talk into that context. But before I go on much further, I'll describe what a plains wanderer is. So a plains wanderer, they're a small bird, standing roughly the same height as, say a pencil, around 18 centimetres tall. They're largely terrestrial, meaning they spend most of their life on the ground, but they are capable of flight. They look like quails, but they're actually unrelated to quail. And I'll talk a bit more about the taxonomic uniqueness in a minute. Unusually for birds, it's the female who is larger and more brightly coloured than the male. So this is her here on the right. She's got a rufous breast, black and white spotty neck, and it's actually the male is a lot more drab and kind of plain brown. But they do have this interesting patterning on the feather, and in terms of their roles, they've actually also reversed, where it's the female who forms the territory and does a lot of the vocalization with a deep, wide-ranging call to both attract mates and probably to keep other females away. And also, interestingly, it's the male who leads a lot of the parenting. So the male does the chick most of the egg incubation and the chick rearing. The female doesn't have much to do with that. The species is also mostly diurnal or crepuscular. So yeah, a lot of people think that the plains wanderer is nocturnal because all the photos you see of them are at night. But yeah, the photographs, mainly an artifact of that's the best time you can actually get close to these birds when they're sleeping and less likely to flush and run away. They actually are mostly active during the day. So during the day, they're foraging around in between grasses and on the ground, looking for invertebrates and seeds to eat. Other parts of their biology, we know very little about their dispersal or movement patterns. We know they're capable of long-distance flight, but we really don't know how frequently or how far they're often dispersing. And a large part of that is because of they're amazingly cryptic. They've got really excellent camouflage for the grasslands, and you just don't see them during the day. They're often all around your feet, and they're almost little ghosts out in the grasslands. I've only had a handful of instances where I've seen them during the day. They have a really amazing camouflage. It's a bit about the plains wanderer. So one of the really amazing things about the species is its taxonomic uniqueness. The plains wanderer is in a family all on its own, Podomidae. The family represents an ancient lineage of birds from Gondwana. So today, the species' closest living relative is actually a seed snipe in South America. So there's nothing else even like it in Australia. There was a close relative found in the fossil record in New Zealand. But yeah, again, plains wanderers are sitting as this really unique species in the world. Interesting, there has been some recent research showing ancient plains wanderers lived in much more forested habitats than they do today, which raises an interesting question around when and why did they become an open plains specialist. I don't have the answer for that, but it'd be an interesting line of research, and makes you think about how they've ended up down this path of avoiding trees. So very different from a forest or a woodland. These are the types of habitats where you find plains wanderers today. All of these are characterised by big, wide, flat landscapes with no or few trees. Now, the main habitat types we see plains wanderers today are lowland, tussock-forming grasslands. But we also see these birds in more of the chenopod-dominated communities in arid Australia. You get more of your salt bushes and bladder bushes and things like that. But yeah, for the most part, your classic kind of plains wanderer habitat is your lowland grasslands. So looking at the historical and current distribution of plains wanderers, we see they have a very large footprint, indicating that they're probably really adaptive little hardy birds for the most part. Their preferred habitat is mostly the darker orange or the hashed orange areas, if in some of the areas where it still exists. So yeah, today the two main population hotspots are in the New South Wales Riverina, around Hay and Deniliquin, north of the Murray River, and then just south of the Murray River, which is west of Echuca on the northern plains of Victoria. So yeah, thinking about the Pteryx, and then also out towards Kerrang, we also reliably find them out there. They're the main hotspots, but there are also some isolated populations which are a bit further afield. Particularly around Bush Heritage property Bulkamata in South Australia, and also up towards southwest Queensland. We also have been regularly detecting some birds up there, and there are some big questions around how many birds are actually living in these more arid habitats and whether these birds persist there, particularly during unfavourable conditions. But there's some really interesting research happening in those spaces at the moment. So we're learning more and more about how those more isolated areas fit into the picture. But obviously, there's a lot of those areas highlighted on the map. There's actually not a grassland there anymore, particularly in Victoria, and I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. So there are many reasons why the plains wanderer has been vanishing since at least the 1800s. But a few of the biggest culprits are habitat loss, principally through conversion of grasslands to cropland. It's a big problem. Foxes and cats make really short work of these pretty naive birds, and overgrazing from herbivores. So that includes domestic cattle and sheep, as well as kangaroos in some parts of the range, have quite not always long-term, but certainly short-term negative impacts on the plains wanderer, stripping really important vegetation structure from the plains wanderer's habitat. So that is a threat as well. And yeah, one of the more frustrating threats to the plains wanderer, particularly a Victorian issue, is the illegal destruction of grasslands for cropping. I know Doug Robinson touched on this in his last talk, so I won't elaborate much further. except to say our environment laws and government agencies have failed to stop illegal clearing for decades now, and this is really undermining a lot of the good work that has been happening in the conservation space for plains wanderers. And yeah, really hoping that turns around soon. So now just talk a little bit about the conservation status of the plains wanderer in this context. So because of these threats over the past 200 years, there are serious concerns that the species could be lost forever. Part of that is because we've seen the population really go down to some critically low levels. We know the population is quite boom and bust, but some of the busts are being very severe. Back in 2015, the species went from vulnerable to critically endangered at a federal level because of what appeared to be a major population crash following the Millennium Drought, and then widespread flooding across New South Wales and Victoria. So a lot of the plains wanderers' habitat went underwater, and there's a lot of grass growth. And then there was very few plains wanderers turned up for a good couple of years, and there was a lot of concern there. So it was really pushed very close to the edge during those years, but there's been a bit of rebound in more recent years, which is good. But the uplisting meant that the plains wanderer is now one of the world's most taxonomically distinct and most threatened species. And this is a really sad picture because all those millions of years of unique evolutionary pathways that the plains wanderers represents could be lost. These species represent this amazing evolution, but also are really at the edge of extinction. They've been identified by an organisation called the Edge of Existence, and they've placed the plains wanderer right at the top in terms of species we need to conserve, because we're really standing to lose something really unique unless we do something. But yeah, as I was saying, it's not all doom and gloom for the species. Particularly the favourable conditions across inland areas of Australia in recent years have seen a major uptick in observations. So hopefully that pattern continues for a while, and we can see the species move away from being one step away from extinction. All right, next slide. Okay, now, so I'm now going to talk a bit more about some work that's been happening on Melbourne's basalt plains. So at the core of this ongoing project is really about testing the assumption that the species is extinct on the Victorian volcanic plains. I think many people have written off the species in this particular area of Australia, but I question whether that is really justified, given how cryptic the plains wanderer is, and certainly some of the challenges around detecting the species. We all know how dangerous it is to write off a cryptic species, given the recent experiences with the Victorian earless dragon. It's been a great lesson that if you don't put in the effort to really search for these critters with the right tools, you're never going to find them. And I think plains wanderer, there's a good case that not enough search effort has gone in to the plains wanderer. So a critical fact is that Melbourne's Western Plains were once the global hotspot for the plains wanderer. During the 1800s and the early 1900s, most records of the species were coming from places around Melbourne, like Brunswick and Coburg and Werribee. In those days, these suburbs represented the fringe between farmland and the city, and people go off in their hunting parties, venture out and come across plains wanderers in the vast grasslands that still remained. So it's a really important thing to keep in mind. Next one. But as we know, Melbourne's grasslands have been vastly and rapidly transformed since those early days, and the plains wanderer has undoubtedly been a loser from all this transformation. And this was identified as far back as 1926 when the early paper on the vanishing plains wanderer was written. We could see that they were in trouble. So yeah, the story around Melbourne unfolded that the great flocks of livestock came with the early colonisers, which changed the structure and composition of grassland. So the plains wanderer had to put up with that. And then came more intensive agricultural practices like cultivation, the end of many of our grasslands, and that was and plains wanderers as simply they weren't used. They weren't used those completely transformed environments. And then there was the array of nasty weeds, which really threatened the delicate function of the ecosystem. So yeah, the nucellas and the box lawns and the artichoke thistles, the plains wanderers, what grasslands were left, were being dramatically changed. And then obviously in more recent years, our growing city continues to gobble up big swaths of grassland, leaving us with not much, and restricting where these birds can now potentially coexist alongside this growth. But despite all these changes in the Melbourne landscape, these birds can continue to surprise us by turning up around Melbourne. Occasional encounters every year or so. Just in the last few years, we have seen them turn up in random places like car parks in Melton, parks in Yarraville, backyards in Croydon. There's been some birds found not far from Castlemaine either. And it makes you think that there must be many more of these birds turning up in suburbia, and people just don't see them before they are taken by predators. So we're probably just seeing a drop in the ocean in terms of birds that are turning up still around Melbourne. And that raises the key question: where are all these birds coming from? Now, I have two main hypotheses for what might be going on. One is that these birds are coming from further afield, or the other one is that they are locals. And I'll talk a bit more about that. My first hypothesis is that these birds are dispersing from somewhere like the Northern Plains, somewhere inland, and they come to Melbourne where their inbuilt GPS tells them there should be grassland, and then they become exhausted looking for their patch, and eventually they run out of juice, and someone finds them. So they're just simply they can't find any grassland where they think they should be grassland. My second hypothesis is that these random encounters with plains wanderers are an artifact of birds moving around the Western Plains of Melbourne, and every now and then that there's this new adventurous bird it's left the Western Plains and it's looking for a new patch and ends up far away from the remaining grasslands, and again ends up exhausted, and someone finds a bird sitting around. So yeah, they're the two kind of working hypotheses. So back in 2022, with some funding support from some zoos Victoria, I worked on a project at La Trobe University that involved identifying the grasslands that were most likely to support any remaining plains wanderer population, and searching with them with some of our newer detection tools. So this is all about trying to either prove or disprove that there could be these birds that are coming from close to Melbourne. The sites ended up identifying were all in the footprint of the Western Grassland reserves, but they were all yet to be acquired and were in fact still working cattle farms. The fact that they were still working farms was really the key thing, as that heavy grazing pressure in this really kind of productive environment was doing a good job of maintaining that important intertussock space that plains wanderers need. Indeed, I caught myself standing out in the middle of some of these farms, and I could imagine myself still being on the northern plains, where I've encountered hundreds of plains wanderers before. The vegetation structure was close to what I would call perfect. The scale of the farms was enough to support multiple plains wanderer territories. So being out there on the ground, I really don't think it was out of the question that one day we will find them there. But yeah, the unfortunate thing was that many of the grasslands that I was looking around in this landscape that had no livestock on them were simply too dense, what I would call too dense for a plains wanderer. Even grasslands that had been burnt multiple times in their history were already back in quite a dense state at the time, and that didn't seem, the regime didn't seem compatible with plains wanderers. It was really that consistent grazing that I think was the best chance of finding them. So to aid the search, the main tools we were using were thermal imaging cameras, like the one you can see mounted to the buggy in the image, and the acoustic recorder, which is in the other image. The thermal imaging cameras work great for plains wanderers because they can pick up this tiny little heat signatures. They can't really rely on their camouflage to get away from you. But it is a difficult exercise on the rocky basalt plains to drive any kind of vehicle around. So I think it is, however, the song meters, the acoustic recorders that offer the best chance of detecting the species if they're still out there. They can operate every day, listening for the plains wanderer's unique call. And we now have a series of these devices positioned across the landscape, waiting and listening for when they might turn up. Now, unfortunately, we are yet to detect the plains wanderer on the Victorian volcanic plains in recent years with these tools. But this project is still ongoing and now being led by colleagues at Zoos Victoria and continues to expand to new sites. So there's certainly still hope that they're hanging on somewhere out there, which is exciting to think about. Regardless of whether we find plains wanderers on the VVP soon or not, there needs to be serious talk about the opportunity the Western Grassland reserves present to be a truly special place for conservation of threatened grassland fauna. I think the proposed scale of the reserve is really impressive, and there's good reason why we should be. I don't think there is a good reason why we shouldn't be aiming for it to be home to species like the plains wanderer, fat-tailed dunarts, grassland elusive dragons, bandicoots. To make this happen, it will need certainly will need serious investment and good management. But to have a wildlife sanctuary like this at Melbourne's doorstep would be a really valuable thing, and something I think Melbournians could be pretty proud of. So yeah, I understand the whole process has been pretty flawed to date, but there's still plenty of time to get some big wins if this is a long term game. So I think we need to be thinking about that kind of thing. I'm now going to change track a little bit and talk more about some of my Northern Plains work and some of the lessons we've learnt when it comes to habitat management on the Northern Plains of Victoria. Mainly because I think these lessons will be useful when it comes to thinking about management of something like the Western Grassland reserves. So yeah, for the past 7 years, I've been undertaking research on the Plains Wanderer and the grasslands in Northern Victoria. Firstly, as a PhD student through La Trobe University, and then as an independent consultant. And yeah, now I'm involved in Plains Wanderer work through Bush Heritage, lead the long-term nocturnal population monitoring project across the Northern Plains. So yeah, over this time, I've been trying to build a picture of what things plains wanderers like in their habitat and what they don't like. But it's important to highlight that this work is building on that of people that have come before me, like my supervisor, David Baker-Gabb, and Mark Antos from Parks Victoria, who have been studying the species for years. But yeah, fortunately for me, when I came on to the scene a few years ago, there were a bunch of new technologies available that afforded me new opportunities to try and understand, to both detect and understand the species' behaviour and ecology. As I spoke about before, thermal cameras have been a huge step up from what used to be the old technique, which was spotlighting. They're a much more powerful detection tool. So my chances of finding these birds to begin with has dramatically improved. And I've also been lucky enough to have the chance to deploy miniature GPS trackers to follow their movements and understand habitat use. You can see in this image of the plains runner in the screen that there is a tiny antenna shooting out along its tail, and these really tiny tracking units have given us wonderful new insights into the plains wanderer's behaviour. I've had an opportunity to deploy over a dozen of these trackers on plains wanderers, and it's given us new insights into what these birds are up to. So yeah, as I mentioned before, a lot of work has gone in to documenting plains wanderers' habitat needs, and particularly a lot of that work is pointing to the preference of plains wanderers for short, open vegetation structure, and this is found in some of the old habitat management guides. And I think a lot of these descriptions are mostly on the money, except there's perhaps a little bit more nuance to the plains wanderers' habitat needs, and I'll talk a bit more about what I found. One of the key things I found was that plains wanderers often use different vegetation structure for foraging versus for roosting behaviour, so daytime versus nighttime. My tracking data showed that plains wanderers will often venture into these patches of relatively denser vegetation to forage during the day, and then usually select more open areas to roost at night. And what this means at a home range scale for these birds is they probably need patchy vegetation structure, structural diversity, not a uniform open state, which was what we previously considered ideal for the species. So yeah, it's important to think about that structural diversity. There's also it's pretty circumstantial. We don't see many of them, but there's also some evidence to suggest that these dense patches are also important for where plains wanderers like to nest as well. But yeah, there's still more research needed in that space. Some other general things I found: evidence for selection towards patches with high biocrust cover, so your lichens and your mosses. And also found, a bit of avoidance of exotic grasses and forbs, which are real culprits of clogging up that intertussock interplant space, which plant wanderers need to in order to move around a bit. Other thing I found was, I didn't see much evidence that vegetation composition was an important factor, but that needs to be acknowledged in the context that I was mainly working in what were degraded grasslands. There wasn't a lot of choice for the birds. We do know that they don't. There is a threshold that we don't find them in exotic pastures or cropland. So it's important in that context, but in terms of subtle changes in plant composition, it doesn't. It seems to be more they select for structure. Looking at the broader scale, site scale, I found one of the best indicators for plains wanderer presence was the proportion of a site that supported vegetation structure in what I'm calling an intermediate state, something that looks like the vegetation in that highlighted in that yellow box. So if you're familiar with the golf ball method for quantifying grassland structure, the state is probably best described as something sitting between 3.5 to 16 golf balls. If you get a golf ball score in this range, you probably have a nice balance for a plains wanderer to feel like they have cover from predators, but they also have enough room to move around on the ground to look for seeds or get away quickly if they need to. So that structure seems to be quite important for them. So thinking about this in the context of what I just spoke about with roosting and foraging, if you were managing a grassland for plains wanderers, you probably want most of the site to be in this open intermediate kind of state, but it needs to be dotted around with patches of denser vegetation, so for that foraging and nesting habitat. And you should be able to get this type of structural heterogeneity through things like strategic livestock grazing or a frequent patch burning regime. On the in the Northern Plains context, livestock grazing continues to be one of the most widely used conservation tools in managing biomass accumulation. And there's multiple factors for that, but some of simply the scale of some of these grasslands that need this constant disturbance process, livestock can deliver that simply, and there's also the long exposure of these grasslands to livestock grazing, and the tolerance of many of the fauna to livestock also enables grazing to be a widely used and useful tool in this context. And finally, just stepping right out to the landscape scale, our studies have identified a couple of key points. First is that plains wanderers seem to be happy to occupy any grasslands on the Northern Plains as long as the structure, the vegetation structure, is right at the time. Previously, there was some speculation that birds were restricted to red clay soil rises in the landscape, but more recent evidence suggests that they're probably less fussy than this, and it's more just a consequence of, is the structure right? Is the grassland big enough to support what I need? Second, it seems an obvious one, but habitat connectivity is likely to be really important to these birds. Results from our long-term population monitoring programs show that the best sites for these birds are those that are large, that are connected to other nearby good sites, which makes sense for these birds. If you've if it's easy to move around and find another new patch when you're dispersing, you're probably less likely to run into danger. And then finally, some of the other recent research that I've been involved with has demonstrated that at a landscape scale, both conservation areas and livestock production farms are important to plains wanderer persistence through time. Grasslands are highly dynamic ecosystems, strongly influenced by interactions between rainfall and disturbance regimes like grazing. And what I found was that during high rainfall years, plains wanderers were more likely to occur on farms because grazing pressure maintains that important open vegetation structure that the birds need. And this compares to the conservation areas, which typically become too dense, even under a little bit of grazing. But then out in the opposite, in the dry years, we found plains wanderers were more likely to occur in conservation areas as the vegetation structure stays open but is not overgrazed, as is typical on the production farms. In summary, these different approaches to managing vegetation across the landscape that you see playing out in conservation areas and across the fence in the production farms, they're playing a complementary role in the provision of habitat for the plains wanderer across space and time. So it's a nice story in terms of agriculture and conservation being able to have a real conservation benefit for a species. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about pests, but they are certainly a big threat to ground-dwelling fauna like the plains wanderer. Plants like boxthorn provide abundant purchase to one of the plains wanderer's natural predators, falcons and harriers, and they also harbour, they provide shelter for foxes and cats as well. So they're certainly an issue and need to be managed. From on the northern plains, although we never see fox or cat interactions with plains wanderers, we know they're contributing to very high mortality of the birds, and fox control is certainly an important part of conservation efforts. And I think it's probably safe to assume foxes and cats are in very high densities on the volcanic plains around Melbourne, and some kind of predator control or predator exclusion will be critical to any efforts to try and protect threatened grassland fauna. So just to wrap up some of the grassland management lessons from the Northern Plains, firstly, grasslands need people. They need active management, and more tools for biomass management you can have at your disposal, the better. Whether it's grazing, fire, both, slashing, mowing, that it really is key to manage the biomass. Second, plains wanderers need diverse vegetation structures at both patch and landscape scale. So it's important to think about scale when you're designing a management plan around vegetation management. And finally, for our native fauna to thrive in native grasslands, we need to think about how the impacts of foxes and cats can be limited, whether that's through predator-proof fencing, removing shelter and den sites for predators, or some kind of lethal control program. You need to do something to give the native critters a chance in most of Australia's ecosystems. So just to finish, there's certainly lots of doom and gloom out there in the grassland conservation space, but there's potential for some big wins if we get things right. Thinking about the Western Grassland Reserves again, they have the scale to support viable populations of unique grassland species, and if we get their management right, I think we could see plains wanderers back on Melbourne's doorstep, which would be a really amazing thing. And I think that has to be something we're aiming for when we're thinking about the reserves. Just thanks everyone for the time and opportunity. just a couple of quick plugs to wrap up. First, there's a wonderful film produced by Remember the Wild on the Plains Wanderer. And yeah, it really is worth watching. And it's actually freely available. If you Google it online, you'll find it. Certainly recommend people watch the film to know more about the Plains Wanderers Conservation Cause. Second, if you want more information on Plains Wanderers and managing habitat, I recently developed a booklet as part of my PhD, which was supported by Trust for Nature. And that's available for download from Trust for Nature's website. There's the link there. Again, you should be able to find it if you're Googling it. And also, if you want to hear more about what's happening on the Northern Plains, and that's of interest, please follow the Northern Plains CMN on Facebook, or you can even become a member of a group that I'm leading at the moment. We're calling ourselves the Northern Plains Conservation Alliance, and that's if you really want to get hands-on, you can contact me about that. And in addition to that, finally, Bush Heritage has a really strong volunteer program, and from time to time, people like myself are looking for assistance with some of our ecological survey work and work in the Plains Wanderers and also out on reserves. So if that's of interest, please reach out. Again, there's a link there. But thanks again, and happy to take any questions from here.